Story 1. If pilots, surgeons, and chief executive officers have age cutoffs for sharpness and stamina, maybe it is fair for presidents too. Leadership needs clarity, not just legacy. Story 2. I would not mind a capacity limit. Leadership requires energy, clarity, and quick decision-making, qualities that naturally decline with age. Story 3. Not interested in an arbitrary age limit, but I would support a cognitive and reading comprehension test. Story 4. We could do this via elections, right? We could choose not to select the oldest person in the primaries, and we could do the same in the general election too. We don't even need a law. How neat. Story 5. The bottom line is we do not need a rule or law to prevent this terrible situation we are in. We need the people to be more informed and not easily manipulated by the media. We could have had an unqualified and inappropriate person for president at any time in our history, but we were too smart to vote for one. Now we have done it twice. Story 6. I used to think this was a good idea until my mother became a chief executive officer at 63 and completely transformed her company. She is more energetic and innovative than most of her younger executives. We need to judge individuals on their merits, not their birth certificates. Story 7. I think 75 would be more reasonable. There are plenty of people more than capable of doing the job at that age. It also depends on whether you mean 65 at the point of election or when they leave office. Otherwise, you would be barred from running once you reach 62, which is on the young side considering it is before the average person has retired. Story 8. It is something I would support. As a 32-year-old, I feel like people in my age group are severely underappreciated and lack representation. I don't think anyone over 60 has any idea what life is like for a middle-class family at this point in time. Things are expensive. Our whole lives are guided by debt. Schooling, housing, and living expenses are exponentially higher than ever compared to the average income. Story 9. No. The problem is the voters. There are under 65 candidates in every election, and they are not chosen properly. We do not need more rules. We need more intelligent voters. Story 10. Yes, at a certain age, none of the things you do in the office will have a long-term effect on you, and thus you will make different decisions than someone who will be around to see the fallout. Story 11. There are many highly competent 70-year-olds. I dislike age limitations because they are arbitrary. Regarding eligibility to run for president, candidates should be required to take the citizenship test publicly, with the results displayed. Like applicants, they only need to score 60% correct. I do not think that is asking too much. Story 12. Look people, age is not the issue here, checks and balances are. I gave you readers credit for more intelligence. Our problem is younger people who are dishonest and have voted to weaken the checks and balances. Citizens United hides dark money payoffs, calls corporations people, and gives them equal or more importance than voters. A Supreme Court that is corrupt and publicly doing the bidding of billionaires is the problem. Stop wasting effort on the few long-term senators and demand ethics for the courts and that Congress enforce the Emoluments Clause. Story 13. I would vote for a mandatory retirement age of 70 for all elected and government positions, from the President of the United States and the Supreme Court of the United States down to town mayors. I would also advocate for term limits on every elected position within every government entity. Story 14. No, I do not believe we should set arbitrary age limits for any job. Aside from being age discrimination, older voters are typically more reliant on the government than working-age individuals. Better voting systems and limits on campaign spending would create better representation regardless of age. Story 15. Actually, no, I would not support it. I am 34 and already tired of people assuming younger automatically means better. My mother is 67 and runs her own technology company better than most millennials I know. We need to focus on competency testing, not arbitrary age limits. Story 16. I would prefer that they require a civics test, a physical examination by an independent party, and a mental fitness evaluation. These results should be certified and made public. No meaningless summaries. Edit. Felonies result in automatic disqualification. Story 17. No. I am interested in cognitive and physical examinations performed by a neutral set of professionals rather than the personal physicians of any elected official. If they are in good shape and have solid standing, they get to do the job. If they are not, they do not. John F. Kennedy was young and impaired with a cocktail of drugs that defies description. Franklin D. Roosevelt had polio, but his mind was very sharp through multiple terms. Bernie Sanders is no spring chicken, and by all accounts, he has the same fervor and acuity he has had for decades. I am interested in setting substantive parameters for competency, not arbitrary limits on factors that can vary greatly from person to person. It is like term limits. I think they are unwise for the basic reason that preventing someone from holding office when they are good is foolish. If someone legitimately does a good job continuously, let them continue. The problem is letting them become complacent. If you fix gerrymandering and make districts consistently competitive, term limits are wholly unnecessary. Story 18, I would not. You need years and years of experience, not just in government but in life in general. If you can only be president between 35 and 65, you are going to get more people who are newbies in government. We know that is a disaster. Story 19. Not sure that age is the biggest problem. You can easily have a 42-year-old who is ignorant, racist, and misogynistic. Story 20. 75. Perhaps. You need someone with varied experience, which requires many years to attain. A better measure is mental competency. These results should not be held privately or based on a bragging, trust me statement with no evidence. Story 21. You can be unpleasant at any age, so it probably will not make much difference. A 40-year-old Donald Trump president would be a menace as well, just for longer. Story 22. A cornerstone of democracy is that every person, regardless of heritage, education, age, wealth, or sex, is allowed to hold public office. If people want a 90-year-old to be their president, he should be allowed to take office. Story 23. There should be no limit. If a candidate is too old, the electorate can decide for themselves. I would like a ban on anyone with a felony conviction. Story 24. Age limits are not the answer here. We need to learn to select candidates properly and understand that just because the nominee was not your favorite, it does not mean they cannot work for you or support your ideas. Like it or not, there are two political parties with the infrastructure needed to win national elections. Story 25. While I believe that some older people could benefit the world with certain policies and knowledge, our problem of career politicians who are out of touch with the rest of the world need to be cycled out. I am not sure a 65 age limit would be appropriate, but as a 50-year-old thinking of a Generation X president, I think the world might be ready for that after the current administration, to be honest. My main problem with the older people in Congress is that they have been there for too long and do not really care about the people anymore. For the most part, they are just keeping their power and lining their pockets. Term limits for Congress, including the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the judicial branch. Yes, even the Supreme Court. Story 26. Don't worry about age. Make it so it is not profitable, expenses covered, and a basic living wage. People who run for office would not want the job for personal gain but would do it for the greater good. The sessions would be short because everyone would want to get the job done and go home. You would have the most efficient and accountable government in history. Story 27. I think I would put the limit at 70 personally, but make that across the board for all political positions. Maybe there could be a special council of elder affairs that is allowed an exception to ensure that portion of the population is not completely unrepresented. Beyond 70, I really don't think you should be making decisions that influence the lives of everyone else decades down the line. It just seems like, even if you are still perfectly sound in mind and judgment, it is not the place of the previous generation to have a stranglehold on the future. Story 28. Election to public office should be pegged to Social Security age plus 3 years. Eligibility to remain in appointed offices, such as courts, should be Social Security age plus 5 years. Without question. Story 29. No, because the most viable and popular candidates are usually the elder statesmen who are able to be elected. Story 30. Some people who are 65 years old and over are the sharpest and hardest working individuals you will ever meet. Some people who are 45 years old are unmotivated and lazy. It is highly individual. Story 31. I remember when MAGA was saying Joe Biden is way too old to be president, when he is only 4 years older than Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump is older and they are okay with it. Cult. Story 32. I am almost 41. We have people in the office who have been there longer than I have been alive. Many do not recognize the world as real, much less as different from the one in the 1980s. We desperately need change. Story 33. I'm going to be the contrarian and say that honestly, not anymore. In 2020, I was all about getting new blood into the White House, openly calling for an age ceiling on social media at that time when we had nothing better to do due to the pandemic. Even Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren I wasn't on board for since we would still be getting someone older. Still, I voted for Joe Biden because, and hoped he would serve as a bridge to the next generation like he was promising. While I think he failed abysmally on that part and we're paying the price from a purely administrative perspective, he was hands down the best president in my lifetime, and a lot of that is owed to experience. Unfortunately, a lot of the country is biased towards fiscal conservatism due to it being easier to analogize to how they must run their personal financial situations, thus us facing a single economic flaw such as inflation tanking his appeal, regardless of why it actually happened. However, Biden steered us through the most dangerous part of the pandemic with a genuine federal response having to be crafted on the fly due to the prior administration, had the best legislative session in decades, and refocused the federal government on policy that created market competition and helped the middle class. A lot of this happened because despite being far from the smartest president we've had, Biden knew the process better than anyone else. His experience, both in the Senate and as vice president, drove the levers he pulled and what he focused on. He also was not afraid to buck generals where it was appropriate, following through on removing our troops from an unwinnable war before they had to deal with the trap Donald Trump had left them in, virtually ending the drone wars and focusing our military response on supporting our partners. Yes, I get the concerns about Israel, but I think this again stems from his ability to view the conflict holistically and recognize the regional dynamic risk a greater conflict had we shown even a hint of pullback in support, putting millions more lives at risk. These calculations, again, come with experience. I have read the retrospectives about the worrying signs of his age behind the scenes, but at the same time there have also been behind-the-scenes stories that tell the opposite. He was supposedly a shrewd negotiator, putting people like Joe Manchin in a position where they felt incentivized to reach an agreement, even while their constituents clearly demanded the opposite and railroading the Republican Party on things like budget deals. Supposedly aides would be terrified to give him briefings because he always used his years of experience to get in the weeds and demanded more details than they could gather. What changed my mind the most, however, was his willingness to take calculated risks. In college, and as recently as 2020, I supported younger candidates on the belief that having to see the consequences of their legacy would drive our leaders to be bolder. What I have come to realize is that it's the opposite, with Barack Obama having been incredibly timid and cautious about trying to do anything too risky. That's what led to the slow recovery, drone wars, and in retrospect some fairly hostile attacks against the press. I firmly believe that if all somebody knew about Obama and Biden was their campaigns and then you described their presidencies to that person, they would easily mix up which was which. While I'm not swearing off young candidates, I now consider experience to be a much bigger factor than I did before. After all, lack of experience could get us a reality TV host just trying to pull bigger grifts. Story 34. Now, there is one thing you might have noticed I do not complain about: politicians. Everybody complains about politicians. Everybody says they are bad. Well, where do people think these politicians come from? They do not fall out of the sky. They do not come from another reality. They come from American parents and American families, American homes, American schools, American churches, American businesses, and American universities, and they are elected by American citizens. This is the best we can do, folks. This is what we have to offer. It is what our system produces. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you are going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. Term limits are not going to do any good. You are just going to end up with a brand new group of selfish, ignorant Americans. So maybe it is not the politicians who are bad. Maybe something else is wrong around here, like the public. George Carlin. Story 35. No. However, there should be in-depth mental and physical evaluations conducted twice a year publicly. If the individual does not meet certain standards, then the position should be vacated. Story 36. No, that would be ridiculous for the same reason I do not support the 22nd Amendment. If the people of the United States want to elect a 90-year-old for a third term, let them. Primaries are held for a reason, and while it would be tough to do so, there is no serious reason not to beyond ageism. Story 37. No. I am generally not a fan of anything that limits the voters' choices. The average people have little say in so much, and I do not want to limit it any further. Story 38. Yes, a 4-year term limit for the president and a 4-year term limit for Congress and the Supreme Court. No more lifetime terms for any position. Story 39. No, limits should be based on function and performance, not arbitrary correspondences. Whenever rules are arbitrary, you will encounter problems because there is nothing in reality that aligns with artificial boundaries. There is no natural reason to say humans become bad at their job when the Earth revolves around the sun 65 times after they were born. At that point, you are just making rules based on astrology, so the rule that the president must be an Aries or cannot be a Gemini is equally invalid. Story 40. I'm not sure if 65 is the cutoff, but I would definitely be in favor of a maximum age of some kind for all elected officials. To be fair, I have also floated the idea in discussions about having a maximum voting age. I realize that is a very different discussion, and I am not even sure I would ultimately support it, but I wish it could be had in good faith. Story 41. I would say 70 years of age at inauguration. Extends to the Senate and House. Mandatory retirement age of 76 for the Supreme Court, plus a 3-term limit for the Senate for a maximum of 18 to 21 years total, and 10 terms for the House for a maximum of 20 to 21 years total. A maximum of 25-year appointments to the Supreme Court. No free benefits for life. They end when you leave. Also, you lose benefits whenever there is not a complete budget for the entire next fiscal year and are ineligible for re-election. Everyone at this level and their spouses are barred from owning any stocks or companies. This extends to the president's children, siblings, and parents. As a replacement, those who are not the president but cannot own anything get a blind $250,000 mutual fund that they can open and change after the president leaves office. Secret Service protection only extends for 35 years maximum. You cannot have separate jobs, book deals, endorsements, or other employment like the Supreme Court often does. No receiving of gifts of any kind except from family members, immediate neighbors, and government colleagues. All gifts over $20 shall be reported. No owning of trusts or corporations designed to shield money and assets from public scrutiny. To prevent gerrymandering, the political mix of House representatives must roughly match the total breakdown of votes for each party statewide. For example, if you have 10 representatives and the total vote breakdown was 55% versus 45% statewide, but you have 7 of one party and 3 of the other, the districts must be redrawn before the next election. Plus ranked choice voting, a maximum limit to fundraising time, and a repeal of Citizens United and similar rulings. Fundraising is not allowed more than 40% out from your theoretical next election. No personal loans to your campaign. Any leftover money from the last election must be donated to charity within 120 days of the election. No building war chests. All judge appointments must be automatically voted on in full within 30 days of submission to avoid delays similar to those caused by Senate leadership regarding Supreme and federal court judges. Removal of the filibuster so basic legislation does not require supermajorities. You are also required to have the median public health care plan in terms of coverage, premiums, copays, and out-of-pocket expenses. The maximum deficit that can be run is 35% of the total budget in an individual year, 10% in a rolling 5-year average, and 0% in a 10-year average. That combined with a fully funded budget requirement will force parties not to entrench around either cutting spending or raising taxation only. Story 42. Yes, because then they have the incentive to make decisions with consequences they will have to live with. Story 43. You would be exempting many experienced candidates. I think 75 years old, with complete physical and mental testing by a real panel of doctors, is appropriate. Story 44. I don't think age should be the focus. Instead, term limits achieve the same goal by ensuring rotation, preventing the same people from serving repeatedly. Story 45. I support term limits on all leadership roles in government, maybe 70 years. However, I support term limits even more. It was never supposed to be a lifetime job. Story 46. I know many people who are 65 or older still working, and I understand why. However, individuals in Congress are well off and could retire. So why wouldn't they? The power that comes with the position is a factor. I understand some may feel that they have something to offer, but to that I say go volunteer or start a nonprofit. Some companies require executives or high-level individuals to retire after a certain age, and I don't see why our representatives should be any different. I would support an age cap for all three branches of government. Story 47. I agree there should be a maximum age, especially since there is a minimum age. 65 seems to be an appropriate maximum age. If a person is elected at 64 and wins a second term, they would be roughly 72 when leaving office. I think this is highly appropriate. If we are setting age and term limits for the president, then these limits should apply to all federal elected offices. Fair is fair. Story 48. No, but maybe some form of health check. They must be able to run 50 meters or swim 19 meters without their heart rate going above 140. Story 49. Give them pensions if you want. Just remove them from office before their minds or values become too outdated to be useful to society. Story 50. I support it along with the same requirement for Congress. To bring all of us into the fold, I also support that people over 65 years old need to pass a driver's test periodically or they lose their license. Before anyone says that I am being mean to older people, I am close enough in age that I will be impacted before most of you making the comment, so keep that in mind. Story 51. All political offices should have term and age limits. The President, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. Story 52. If there are age limits to joining the military, then there should be age limits to political leadership. Story 53. Yes, for all branches of government, judicial, legislative, and executive. Do you know how easy it is to become out of touch with most of the American population? All it takes is a few shifts in different demographics. Age, wealth, connections, peer group. Age is a significant factor that is easy to control. Story 54. I would go further. No public office can have a term started by someone after their 60th birthday. At 60, you are too out of touch with society. Story 55. Yes, I would support that. Regardless of party, cognitive decline is a real issue, and we need to protect our country by having a competent, sharp, and alert mind in the Oval Office. It is simply a matter of logic. Story 56. No. What would be your reasoning for that? Though I would be all for a test to be given for health and mental issues, as well as a test about history and current events, and a test of their understanding of the current economic lives of the median and average American voter. Being able to answer questions regarding the prices of groceries, gas, income, rent, utilities, house prices, and so on. I am fine with a president who is 65, but I am not comfortable with a president not knowing the price of milk and bread. Story 57. I would say that once an elected member of the federal government turns 65, they can no longer be elected or re-elected. Yes, that would result in some experience leaving, but it would also bring in new blood more often. Story 58. Old enough to qualify for full Social Security is too old to be working in the government. Story 59. I find it interesting that many people feel we need special laws to limit the right of voters to make poor choices and elect the wrong person. If someone who is old and out of touch is running, vote for the other candidate, problem solved. The real problem is that elections have ceased to be fair, and voters are generally bad at choosing what is best for themselves. This problem has many causes. The two-party system, money in politics, and poor education. Fix these problems and the rest will go away. Story 60. Absolutely not. I want the best person for the job, someone that Americans want. However, I would be willing to eliminate political parties, where a small percentage of Americans decide what is best for corporate America rather than what is best for all Americans. Story 61. Definitely not. I have a problem with young presidents because they tend to intertwine their power and sexuality, for example, Bill Clinton and John F. Kennedy. Story 62. I do not like the idea because there are very sharp 70 and 80-year-olds. I would not want them to be barred from the race. Story 63. No, I am not falling for this Generation Z ageism nonsense. I do not love the idea of presidents aged 75 and older, but let them run if they want. Story 64. Retirement should be at 60, and if you can legally retire, you should not run for an office position. Story 65. Instead of a flat age limit, regular cognitive and physical health checks for anyone running after a certain age seem fair. At a certain point, health issues can arise. Mental sharpness might decline slightly. Story 66. A mandatory retirement age of 70 would solve a surprising number of problems in this country, and it is the international norm. Story 67. As far as I am concerned, the only people who should hold any form of public office are those who will actually be affected by the rules. No politician should be able to amass wealth at a rate that outpaces the national median. Story 68. Absolutely. Also, require that people still driving start retaking the driving test every 1 to 2 years after turning 65. Story 69. Absolutely. By the time you reach that age, you are out of touch with every generation that actually needs your help. Story 70. I am not American, but I believe there should be an age limit not only for the president but for all politicians, including the prime minister here in the United Kingdom. Beyond a certain age, they become out of touch with current reality. How can we trust them to make laws that affect today's young people when they are still thinking based on experiences from 50 years ago? We need younger politicians. Story 71. I think the age upon election or inauguration should be capped at 65, but if a president turns 65 during their term, they should be allowed to finish it. Story 72. Why are we going to blame the older individuals because people vote for them? Every election has a range of candidates of different ages with a free selection. It makes no sense to limit the electorate, even if they vote for someone with objectionable views. Story 73. I am going to be 75 this year. I do not drive tractor trailers over the road anymore. I cannot see that well even with my glasses, and my reaction time is not what it used to be. I wholeheartedly support competency testing for people like me for driving my pistol license and if I held any public office. I am still a volunteer paramedic, but I mostly teach new medics now. I am only there if the situation becomes serious. My skills are fine, but I could not do the 24-hour shifts like I used to, no way. I get tired, my eyes get sore, and that is mistake territory. I live on medication due to September 11th. I take 3 oxycodone tablets a day. My knees and shoulders are damaged, my hips are replaced, and I am not in good enough shape to give the position my full effort. This is as honest as I can be. I know I am not fit for public office or safety-sensitive situations. I have earned the right not to be involved in that anymore. I put in my time in the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam, New York City Emergency Medical Services, and side work as a constable and delivering boats as a captain for my brother. It is time I teach a young man and get out of the way. If you will excuse me, the dog and I are having breakfast and watching Barney Miller. Story 74. 65 is too young. 75 is more realistic. I think people should be allowed to have a full career in the private sector and then move into politics if they desire. There should be an age limit for running for a new term, not a mandatory removal once someone reaches a certain age. 72 is the number that makes the most sense. I believe setting a maximum age of 72 for running in a new election is reasonable. Story 75. No. First, it is somewhat arbitrarily ageist. I agree that people with a decade or less left to live on average have less skin in the game, and I agree that their mental faculties on average tend to be in decline, but I do not think that means they cannot do the job. Second, many people work past 65, and doing so is probably good for the Social Security system and saves a bit from the duration of the lifelong pension that presidents receive. Every little bit helps. If a public servant with a wealth of knowledge from a lifetime of service wants to serve and is deemed competent by a majority of voters, the upper bound of their age was already considered in that vote. That said, Recent events show that gerontocracy can be a real risk, and if for no other reason than the argument that a public servant should have real skin in the game, there is a possible compromise. A more reasonable, less overtly discriminatory standard would be that the president has to be at or under the maximum age for claiming Social Security 70 to take office for the first term. This is somewhat arbitrary but curbs the gerontocracy issue without excluding retirees or Medicare recipients from having fair representation. A similar standard can be applied to the Senate and House. Story 76. Since the fitness tests are obviously a sham, then yes, 65 or the current retirement age would be appropriate. I would support that across all levels of government. Story 77. I would say that no one can be elected or appointed to any job anywhere in the government if they are over 67. No official can hold the job past their 73rd birthday. Story 78. We have minimum ages to attain office but no maximum. Why? I believe the military mandates a retirement age for general officers, which is 64. I am not sure why there is an arbitrary age linked to mandatory retirement for officers when the commander-in-chief can be 80 and run for a 4-year term. I support limiting the age but would be challenged to determine what that age should be. 65, 70, or 75. Story 79. Okay, so this is an American question. Your whole system is broken and needs to be fixed from the ground up. First and foremost, identification should be incredibly cheap and easy to obtain for everyone. Then you show it to prove who you are and vote one time. On a weekend, so most people can attend. And you have a month of early voting for those who can't. Australia has one of the best systems in the world, and it's time your country took notice of how better places handle elections. Story 80. I would say you cannot be elected or appointed to any public office in the United States if you are over 65 at the time. Most offices have 4-year terms, so you would be out by age 69. Even 6 years for the Senate, ending by age 71, would be a significant improvement. There should also be age and term limits on lifetime appointments, such as the Supreme Court. Perhaps establish a mandatory retirement age of 70 and a term limit of about 15 years for those appointed young enough for it to apply. I am not sure of the exact ages and term lengths for each case, but I believe the general idea is reasonable. It is common sense and surprising that it is not already implemented. Story 81. Honestly, yes. I support an age limit of 65 for the presidency. Not because older people are not smart or experienced, some are absolute legends, but because leading a country today requires high energy, mental sharpness, and the ability to relate to modern problems. It is not just about reading off a teleprompter and waving at crowds. It is about making decisions on technology, artificial intelligence, climate change, and issues that did not even exist when some candidates were in high school. If we trust people less to drive or operate machinery at a certain age, why are we okay with them handling nuclear weapons and shaping the future of millions? Story 82. I think we should start smaller, perhaps by limiting the presidency to people who are not racist, misogynistic, vile, evil, or psychopathic wannabe dictators who have tried to overthrow the government and are as anti-science as possible. If we could start there, I would be completely fine with a 66-year-old. Story 83. They require military recruits to take a test before joining the military. I do not see why presidential candidates should not be required to take one, with even higher standards to lead that same military. The public should have access to the results of those tests as well. Why are standards set so high for less important roles in society, but the most important role has no standards at all? This is a backwards way of doing things. Story 84. Yes, commercial pilots have mandatory retirement at 65, which highlights the need for younger minds and physical fitness. Story 85. 65 should be the eldest any member of Congress, the Senate, or the president could be. These elders have had their chance. They have done a terrible job. No government position should extend beyond 4 years without re-election as well. Story 86. Yes, and limit all other elected officials to 2 terms. Politics is not supposed to be a career. While we are at it, eliminate lifetime health insurance after retirement. They need to go on Medicare like the rest of us. Story 87. Don't get me wrong, an age limit would be nice, but I've met really healthy people aged 70 to 75 years. Past that, though, even if they are mentally present, all the medical issues and fear of falling and becoming seriously ill start happening. 75 and older has no business in politics, in my opinion. Story 88. Age 65 or the end of their current term, and then leave. That applies to all of the elderly running the government at any level. Otherwise, you see them having medical emergencies on live television during interviews or find out they are in a nursing home with dementia. This is serious. Story 89. We no longer have a president here in the United States. We have a fascist dictator and now live in a fascist state. Story 90. No. I do not care about the age as much as the ideas. Good ideas come from anywhere. I might not vote for Bernie now that he is 83 and would be 87 before the next election, but I would consider him over 95% of the current options. Story 91. I am not a fan of the existing minimum age limit. The main barrier to who people elect to represent them in a democracy should be the election itself. Story 92. No, I think the upper age limit to run for the presidency should be 70. A 70-year-old could run but would not be eligible for a second term. 75 is where the drop-off is for many elderly people. Story 93. I get the point, but someone like Bernie Sanders proves that it is very prejudiced to think all older people do not care about the future. Donald Trump clearly does not, but I think he never really cared about anyone but himself anyway. At age 65, we expect to still live for quite a while. Having said all that, the United States of America is currently clearly a gerontocracy, and that is not supposed to happen either. I understand that people in their 20s rarely lead their country, but if there had to be a dominant age in politics, I would say the age between 30 and 50, because that at least proves that new blood has a chance to. You can never change anything if the same people are sitting in the seats for literally decades. Story 94. Any other job in any other industry is basically going to start nudging you towards the door as soon as you reach 65. I see no reason a literal world leader should be held to a different standard. If you turn 65 during your term, you can finish it, but then you are done. Story 95. After someone's second term, they should be sacrificed. It would prevent people from going into office for personal reasons. Story 96. No. It is an elected position. If I had a choice between Marjorie Taylor Greene and Bernie Sanders, I would choose Bernie Sanders despite his age. Just stop electing seniors if you do not want to see them in office. Look at Mitch McConnell. He kept getting voted into office even though he should have retired. I do agree with term limits on the Supreme Court, though. The whole process is concerning. Story 97. I would prefer a requirement for individuals to pass a basic 5th grade civics test. That would have prevented former President Donald Trump and the current situation. Story 98. I would say if it goes beyond that, they need a rigorous test to prove capability, but that would take years to develop. Story 99. Now, despite what you like or dislike about Donald Trump, he is still very active compared to how Joe Biden was, and he is literally pushing 80 years old. Story 100. You have no business being in politics if you are retirement age and have never had to work for minimum wage. I think there should be an age limit and a poverty probationary period where they have to live off minimum wage for at least a year. Story 101. I think this should apply to all global leaders. Anyone over 65 is unlikely to experience the consequences of their political actions. Story 102. Depends on what you mean. I think there is tremendous underappreciated value in experience, which takes time to accumulate. I would be in favor of 65 being required to take office to run for a first term or 69 for a non-consecutive second term. That puts the exit for an 8-year continuous term at 74, which I think is reasonable. Working backward, let's say that candidate is a sitting governor 6 years in. That makes them governor at 59. A job which also requires experience. Story 103. Some age limit is needed since Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both too old. I have always argued for mandatory retirement of all government officials at age 76 or 71. 65 might be too young since many people start their political careers after finishing their previous careers in their 50s. There is a significant problem with federal judges who refuse to retire. Story 104. No. There is already a built-in check for if the candidate is too old. It is called voting. I would rather have a robust process by which we choose the best candidate based on all available evidence than filter out quality candidates on criteria that are flexible for most Americans. Story 105, maybe 75, and put an age limit or term limits on the House of Representatives and the Senate too. Too many just will never leave. Story 106. Government would be vastly improved if the rules applied to unelected and elected citizens were applied equally. Make Congress and the President limited to Social Security and Medicare instead of a pension. Make health insurance available to Congress and the President available to all citizens. Make the salary increase for the President and Congress tied to the minimum wage by percentage increase. Story 107. Great idea, but setting an age limit past older individuals, near seniors, and aspiring seniors already there makes it a non-starter. To make progress, you would have to grandfather all current seniors in the House and Senate and increase the age limit to 70 or 75 to have any chance. Story 108. I would support this for our Prime Minister, even though our Australian leaders have not been near the ancient age of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Story 109. I used to support age limits until I started working with elderly judges. What matters is not the number but mental acuity and physical health. I would rather have a sharp 70-year-old who understands modern issues than a 45-year-old who is stuck in the past. Story 110. I would hate to think that Bernie Sanders would have to quit. Ben Franklin was 81 during the Constitutional Convention. It is not age per se, it is senility. Story 111. In my country, at that age, they would be dead within 1 to 2 years of their presidency or try to run again for all government positions until they reach 100 years old. Story 112. I'm 68, in good health and not ready to retire. My former bosses agree with me. I'm still working part-time at their request and consulting on plans and hiring. Should there be term limits? Yes, but the risk of brain drain makes it more complicated than you might think. Should there be age limits? No, but cognitive tests are under consideration as far as I'm concerned and would likely eliminate the Republican majority. Story 113. One thing to consider. Many working-class people cannot afford the time to get into politics until they retire. Granted, I cannot tell you the last time one of those people got into the House of Representatives or the Senate, but I know a few who have gone to our state legislature. Other than that, let's say 67. Story 114. I do not think there is an age limit of 65, but maybe a mental acuity test where the score is published. Story 115. It would have eliminated some recent poor choices, but you know that someday someone will come along and people will say that it is a foolish rule, and he or she should be allowed to run. I would be more in favor of some kind of basic mental fitness test. Story 116. 65 should be the retirement age for all political positions, including a 2-term maximum for all political positions. Story 117. Yes. Eligible to run from 35 to 65 years old. Can finish term if over 65. Same for the United States Congress. We have members running the country, and it is a disaster. Story 118. I would not say 65, but I advocate for a moving goalpost. 7 years younger than the average age of death at any point in time. The same applies for the Supreme Court. So, if we live longer, then we can work longer. Story 119. I would not, for the same reasons, restrict voting based on arbitrary categories. A democracy should be as inclusive as possible. The will of the people should bar candidates from office, not bureaucratic obstacles. Similarly, I disagree with the minimum age requirement and the natural-born citizen requirement. Let the people decide. Story 120. Age does not always equal ability, but it definitely affects stamina and mental flexibility. I would not mind a cap, not to discriminate, but to make sure leadership stays connected to the pace of the modern world. Story 121. Tough call because knowing Donald Trump is much closer to fulfilling his contract with the Lord is a source of daily encouragement. Story 122. If it can be done by the legal method through a constitutional amendment, then I will agree with any changes like that. The amendment process is meant to be a long, difficult process to ensure that everyone is aware of what the changes will do, both positive and negative. Story 123. I would implement term limits. I would also require testing so that all members of Congress, the president, the cabinet, and others know what the job entails. Additionally, I would ban felons from holding office. It would be mandatory that they have no financial connections related to their official duties, and they would be prohibited from accepting jobs from any company related to their work in office. Furthermore, no bribes, not even a free pen, should be allowed. Voters need serious civic education. We need to bring that back and emphasize its importance. Story 124. I support age limits and term limits for our elected positions. This is to prevent power concentration in one person and to account for the possibility of mental decline, among other reasons. Story 125. 1. Ranked choice voting. Age and term limits for House of Representatives, Senate, Judiciary, and President. House of Representatives, no more than 65 years old at election, no more than 6 two-year terms. Senate, no more than 65 years old at election, no more than 3 six-year terms. President, no more than 65 years old at election, no more than 2 terms. Supreme Court, no more than 60 years old at elevation, must resign at 70 years old. Story 126. Yes, I would like to see terms and the entire system redone. 6-year presidents, no second term. 4-year senators, maximum 3 terms. 3-year representatives, maximum 4 terms. Mostly, we need to get money out of politics. The idea that money is speech is false. It is a vicious cycle of media driving controversy, politicians responding to controversy with ads, and media taking ad money. Rinse and repeat. Lobbying gains the influence it needs to manipulate the system for its own benefit. The public good cannot compete with that, as 1% holds more than 90% of the wealth. Politicians play along because it benefits them financially. Story 127. If there is a minimum age for being president, there should be a maximum age as well. This applies to all elected officials. Lifetime appointments should not be allowed, especially for the Supreme Court. Story 128. Biden was not that bad. The problem with the Donald Trump debate was primarily caused by Donald Trump. If Biden had been coached on how to respond to Donald Trump's frequent use of selective information, he would not have become confused. Story 129. Become consistent within the government framework. Mandatory retirement age across the board. House of Representatives, Senate, Presidency is 67 years old. Term limits for House of Representatives and Senate. House 9 terms, Senate 3 terms. These positions were never meant to be careers. Story 130. No, because everyone ages differently. Some people in their 80s are still sharp, whereas some people in their 60s decline. I would love for more young people to get involved in politics and for more senators to consider who will succeed them in official or unofficial roles within their party. Or for people to simply choose to retire. At some point, you have to ask yourself why people do not want to retire. Story 131. All government offices of any power and authority should have term limits and age limits. If you are 65 and your average constituents are 30 to 40, you have little to nothing in common with them. You do not know what they want. You know what you want. As we have seen, most who have gotten that power are unable to discern the difference, and it is time they go. No more guidance is needed from the fully aged who would not even sit next to a person of color on a bus. Their generations manipulated and destroyed the world and its economies, waging war after war. They enjoyed affordable housing, less than 40-hour work weeks, business loans granted in minutes, and countless freedoms that the majority of us now will never experience. Then they passed the debt down to the rest of us while retaining their control over the world and telling all of us that this mess is our fault when they were the only ones here to make the mess in the first place. They made all the monsters and have us sacrifice ourselves to fight them. It is not about left or right, Democrat, Republican, liberal, black or white or red or blue or turquoise. It is about what we know is wrong and what we know is right. And we know this has been wrong for a long time. The only way to fix it is by thinking about what comes next and how to make it the best possible world, and acting on it for the next generations so they are not left with the mess that the rest of us have been cleaning up since birth. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.